Good morning. Inspired by the young people in the room, I'm going to do something I almost never do, and that is to try to use the iPad. Technology fails often, and we'll see whether the iPad manages to stay on top of this table here. You know, Karen admits that we've known each other for well over 30 years, I realize. And that was when she was 6 and I was about 9. Karen, when she invited me to give the keynote this morning, I must admit that we said yes almost immediately, and it didn't matter what else we were doing. We would move it, because Karen asks so little on so few occasions. From those of us she constantly inspires, that it is easy to say yes. There is no one else in my generation who has done more to make me think big, to make me think courageously, and who has inspired me to act on those ideas. And so I want to ask you to join me at the outset in applauding the wonderfully inspiring Karen Pittman. If Karen had read my bio, which I am grateful she did not, you would find that I have had a checkered career, and I came to a lot of these issues later than others. I will admit in this room to just my closest friends that I started my career as a corporate tax and securities lawyer and law teacher. I don't generally admit that. And when I came over to the policy side of the world, after working a bit and learning a lot, a question occurred to me. And the question was this: how could we know as much as we do, spend as much as we do, care as much as we say we do, and accomplish so little for so many kids over so long a period of time as permanently to compromise their ability and capacity to grow, develop, and mature into competent parents, productive participants in the economy, and effective citizens? How is it? And I must admit that the answer that I derived was even less encouraging than the question. We don't know as much as we think we do. And all too often we lack the personal courage and political will to act on what we do know. We don't spend as much as we need to, but until we do better with what we have, it's going to be tough to make the case for what we need. And we don't care as much as we say we do, because some kids matter more than others, and some kids matter not at all. And it is the sharpness of that answer that has driven much of my career for the last 2 decades, and it explains in part why I lead the campaign for grade level reading, and I've called upon and counted on so many of you, including folks in this room. And if I were to talk about the campaign for grade level reading, it is not just that we know we need a generation of high school graduates who will provide the workers to compete in the global economy, who will provide the folks for military that will protect the nation, who will populate colleges and universities and allow the United States to maintain its competitive edge and contribute something to the world. It is in part because we need a generation of high school graduates as a critical strategy for disrupting intergenerational poverty. And when we think about the inflection point seems to be grade level reading by the end of third grade. Kids who read on grade level by the end of third grade tend to graduate from high school, including low-income kids. Kids who don't read on grade level by the end of third grade tend not to graduate from high school, especially low-income kids. So the work we have done over the past 3 years is to talk about this and think about it and encourage communities, and we have been overwhelmed by the response, and there are lots of reasons for that. And one of these days we will write the book that will say that this was a beautifully conceived plan that was implemented flawlessly, and when we write that book, please look for it in the fiction section of your local bookstore, your library. And at the level of involvement exceeded our aspiration. That rarely happens and ought to happen to everybody at least once in their career. We think there's something else going on, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But what we are focusing in on is a group of children who are unlikely to succeed, even if we get the schools working and if we have a quality teacher in every classroom. And that's heresy, but it's an inconvenient truth. And those children are the children who start out too far behind to catch up in this short period we have. And that's not about the kids, it's about the resources we're willing to expend. They're the kids who, for various reasons, miss so much school. So many days of school and so much instruction, it doesn't matter what's going on in the classroom because they're not there. And the kids who fall behind every summer and come back to school in September, having lost 2 or 3 months, and they're farther behind than when they left in June. Those children who start out behind, fall behind, and lose ground every year, those are the kids who are going to be mathematically eliminated from the third grade reading sweepstakes and whose lives are going to be significantly later. Those are the kids that we have focused on in this campaign for grade level reading. And many of those kids are among the 1 million or so kids that are born every year into poverty. So think about the 1 million kids in this country that will be born into poverty this year. And on the day they are born, we are able to predict with certainty that 50% of them will spend half of their childhoods in poverty, that 29% of them will live in high poverty communities, that 10% of them will be born low birth weight, an indicator of cognitive delays to come, that only 60% of them will have had health care. And that statistic has changed. By age 3, fewer than 75% of them will be in good or excellent health, and they'll be 3 times more likely than their more affluent peers to have elevated blood levels. That 50% of them will test 12 to 14 months behind the national norm in language and pre-reading skills. that nearly 50% of them will start first grade already 2 years behind their peers, that during the early grades, they're more likely to miss 20 or more days of school, that 80% of them will test below proficient in math and reading by the end of third grade, that 22% of them will not graduate from high school, and that number goes to 32% for those who spend more than half their life in poverty. And to no one's surprise, these awful statistics become catastrophic when we think about kids of color. You know, I think Karen's focus on readiness is absolutely correct. But, the question before whether the young people will be ready and what will it take? And so the question is, are we ready? Are we ready to do what we can and what we must if those 1 million children born this year will have the more hopeful future that they deserve? Are we willing to ask the hard questions and make the tough choices? Are we ready to find the personal courage and political will to close the gap between what we know and what we do? To follow science without making it a religion? To attend to evidence without disdaining the experience, intuition of practitioners and the insight and wisdom of lived experience? Are we ready to make the tough decisions that will allow us to deploy the resources we have more wisely and more effectively? To decide what to cut, what to cap, what to grow, and in what to invest? Are we ready to take up the deeply intertwined challenges of race, ethnicity, and poverty, and without yielding an inch on race and ethnicity, step up to the challenge of disrupting intergenerational poverty that makes everything else so much harder to solve? Are we ready to answer this question? How is it that those of us who are involved in program, how is it that we can consistently report good outcomes and yet have those good outcomes aggregate up to so little impact? How is it? And let me admit that philanthropy is a big part of the problem, because we reward reporting on good outcomes, and people do. The story we like to tell on this is that in the 1988 Olympics, neither U.S. 4x100 team medaled. And by the way, forget it about checking it, it's been fact-checked. The first time I said it, about 9 people pulled out their smartphones and began checking it. You know, you have this sinking feeling. So far, nobody's raised their hands, saying it's wrong, so please, if you find it, call me in the corner. But neither team medaled, even though 4x100, right? Even though they ran the fastest laps. Why is it? Because both the men and the women's team muffed the handoff, dropped the baton. The work that we do is more of a relay than it is a sprint. It is not how fast we run the first, second, or third leg. It is whether we get the handoff right. And what we do in philanthropy, we reward the legs and invest nothing in the handoff. And that is why we have so many people reporting such good outcomes, and we see virtually no impact at the population level on anything we care about. Are we ready to work hard to add to civic action and advocacy? A commitment to build a common sense consensus, a consensus that requires us to search for values and frames and messengers that will allow us to reach across the aisle to transgress the all too comfortable borders and boundaries of geography, politics, partisanship, and ideology? Or do we just want to stay in our corner, count to 10, and come out fighting every time? And are we ready for what is even harder, more risky, more daunting than speaking truth to power? Are we ready to speak truth to each other and speak truth to ourselves? In that regard, are we willing to admit that it is very hard for us to let go of the warm and fuzzy programs that we love so much, even though we know they don't really work, they can't be replicated, and they certainly won't be scaled. But we so love them that we want to continue to expend valuable and scarce resources because they make us feel good. Are we ready to let go of them? Are we ready to admit that what we have in some cases is caring without believing? You know, I had this tragic moment recently. I had in the room 40 of the people upon whom I depend to move the grade level reading agenda. And these are 40 people who care deeply about the children. And there was this moment when I realized that the majority of people in this room, in that room, who worked so hard and gave so much and cared so deeply, did not believe that this is work that could be done. You know, it reminded me of, I was watching television on that day in the summer of 2008 when Senator Barack Hussein Obama was nominated to be the Democratic candidate for the presidency of the United States. And, you know, and I was caught up in, well, how are they going to get the votes and who will pass? Because, of course, we need Senator Clinton to come in and make it unanimous, you know, and I'm a political junkie and a policy wonk, and I was all into the mechanics of that. And then the moment happened, and, you know, you see grown men and women on the floor hugging each other and crying. And then they cut to the commentators, and my favorite commentator, Donna Brazile. Donna Brazile, for the first time ever on air, was choked up. And she says, you know, I've worked for this all my life, but I didn't believe it would happen in my lifetime. And I understood at that moment she spoke for me and for a number of us. We had worked and hoped, and some of us even prayed for that moment without really believing it would happen. We had worked and hoped and prayed for it because it was the right thing to do, and it happened. But that is the exception. When you know that question that they ask every presidential candidate, who are your heroes, and you know how 90% of them get the question wrong as if it's a surprise? You know, teachers are my heroes. Teachers are my heroes. Not just those who taught me, but those teachers who go into communities every day, who go into communities where lawyers and doctors don't make house calls, where social workers are reluctant to go, where firefighters go only if accompanied by police, and police go only if they're armed. Teachers drive into those neighborhoods every day because they care about those kids. And so it breaks my heart when I have to say to those teachers who go into that neighborhood, go into that school, and close the door, and try to give those kids a little solace, provide an oasis, feeling that no matter what they do, that the forces outside that classroom and outside that school are so powerful that these kids really don't have a future. But for some hours during the day, the school can become, and the classroom is, a kind of a refuge. It breaks my heart when I have to tell those teachers that they care and don't believe. And when you care and don't believe, when you try to create the oasis, what you have become is a hospice worker. And I say this with deep affection for hospice workers because those of us who have needed hospice workers in our own lives, with our own families, know that it is an incredibly important job to get people to face the inevitable with dignity and with a modicum of pain. But when teachers become hospice workers, children die because we ignore their futures and we kill their dreams. Well, in many respects, those of us who do this work because we care passionately but don't believe have joined the hospice industry. But I don't want to be harsh, because there's some reasons why we don't believe. And as I looked at the people on my team, who I think care but don't believe, I had to admit that most of them had not seen anything change. I had to admit that they could not imagine what change looked like. And imagination is really important. Governor Kane, in talking about 9/11, said that he says, we had a failure of policy, we had a failure of execution, we had a failure, he repeated failure after failure. He says, but what was more important is we had a failure of imagination. And many of us cannot imagine what the world would look like if we disrupted intergenerational poverty. We cannot imagine what it looks like, and if we can't imagine it and we don't believe it, it's going to be really hard to make the tough decisions that'll move us along the way. But there's another failure in which we all have to share, and that is the absence of narratives of success. Those of us who are advocates, big and small, we are constantly looking at the North Star, constantly pushing. And so we don't pause to celebrate the small successes, the medium-sized successes, or even the big successes. Most of us don't know that any of this has ever succeeded. And part of what we have to do is to go to public health and find a dozen, and maybe dozens of successes from which we benefit. We have to go to the Green Revolution and the amazing advances made in international agriculture. We need to find and understand that having a zero carbon footprint isn't a miracle. It is simply achievable. We need to sort of come home and realize that for a moment in time there was a responsible fatherhood movement that in fact moved the needle significantly, and not just statistically significantly, but meaningfully significantly with respect to paternity establishment, with respect to father engagement, with respect to the payment of child support, and yes, with respect to teen parenting. We need to find and lift up narratives of success so we can recruit a new generation into not only caring, but believing. You know, why we do this work is not just about any particular small success. Much of the work we do, and I'll come back now to this third grade reading. This work is a proxy about the compact we have between and among generations. What are we saying to the next generation if we don't do something as simple as teaching them to read? Why should they believe that we care about them, and when it's their turn, they should care about us? If we manage to do what is before us, if we take on and take up Karen's challenge of ensuring readiness, we have a glimmer of hope that the next generation will believe that we care enough about them that we might act to give them a planet with clean air to breathe, water to drink, landscapes to enjoy, that we might be able to give them a world that is safe, a nation that is secure and at peace, that we might be able to solve some of the big problems so that we don't only leave them a balanced budget or swallow debt, that we leave them value in the form of an infrastructure that's not collapsing and crumbling. And we don't leave them the crushing burden of intergenerational poverty because we have not had the personal courage or political will to solve it. The work we do is a proxy for that compact. And what Karen calls us and what she requires from us is not just to ensure readiness, but to be ready ourselves. Let me end by reminding you of the book and the movie There Are No Children Here, which is about the travails of a family in public housing in Chicago. It's about 25 years ago. It was made into a movie. At the end of the movie, they interviewed on camera real children who lived in that public housing development in Chicago. And the last interview, at least the last one I recall, was of a young woman, a 12-year-old really. And the off-camera interview asked her about her future. And she paused for what seemed to be an interminable time, and she says, "My future." And she paused again, and she finally said, "I can't imagine my future." We live in the richest nation in the history of the world, and we have kids that plan their funerals and can't imagine their futures. This is a disaster. This is unconscionable, and we should resolve that the 1 million children born this year when they're 12, that none of them will be in a position where they can say with that 12-year-old girl, "I can't imagine a future." They should be ready to answer that question. Thank you.